Hello, I'm Christine Rendel, and this is Voices of Calm. Thank you very much for joining me and my fellow narrators as we bring you tales, poems, snippets of stories, all meant to inspire, to cheer, to amuse. I'm going to read a story by the English writer P.G. Wodehouse. It comes from one of his very early collections of short stories back in 1917, and this one's called Bill the Bloodhound. There's a divinity that shapes our ends. Consider the case of Henry Piffield Rice, detective. I must explain Henry early to avoid disappointment. If I simply said he was a detective and let it go at that, I should be obtaining the reader's interest under false pretenses. He was really only a sort of detective, a species of sleuth. At Stafford's International Investigation Bureau in the Strand, where he was employed, they did not require him to solve mysteries which had baffled the police. He had never measured a footprint in his life, and what he did not know about bloodstains would have filled a library. The sort of job they gave Henry was to stand outside a restaurant in the rain and note what time someone inside left it. In short, it is not Piffield Rice, investigator number 1, the adventure of the Maharaja's ruby, that I submit to your notice, but the unsensational doings of a quite commonplace young man, variously known to his comrades at the Bureau as Fathead, that blighter what's-his-name, and here, you. Henry lived in a boarding house in Guildford Street. One day, a new girl came to the boarding house and sat next to Henry at meals. Her name was Alice Weston. She was small and quiet and rather pretty. They got on splendidly. Their conversation, at first confined to the weather and the moving pictures, rapidly became more intimate. Henry was surprised to find that she was on the stage, in the chorus. Previous chorus girls at the boarding house had been of a more pronounced type. Good girls, but noisy and apt to wear beauty spots. Alice Weston was different. "I'm rehearsing at present," she said. "I'm going out on tour next month in The Girl from Brighton. What do you do, Mr. Rice?" Henry paused for a moment before replying. He knew how sensational he was going to be. "I'm a detective." Usually, when he told girls his profession, squeaks of amazed admiration greeted him. Now he was chagrined to perceive in the brown eyes that met his distinct disapproval. "What's the matter?" he said a little anxiously, for even at this early stage in their acquaintance, he was conscious of a strong desire to win her approval. "Don't you like detectives?" "I don't know. Somehow I shouldn't have thought you were one." Well, this restored Henry's equanimity somewhat. Naturally, a detective does not want to look like a detective and go the whole thing away right at the start. "I think you won't be offended." "Go on." "I've always looked on it as a rather sneaky job." "Sneaky?" moaned Henry. "Well, creeping about, spying on people." Henry was appalled. She had defined his own trade to a nicety. There might be detectives whose work was above this reproach, but he was a confirmed creeper, and he knew it. It wasn't his fault. The boss told him to creep, and he crept. If he declined to creep, he would be sacked instantly. It was hard, and yet he felt the sting of her words, and in his bosom the very first seeds of dissatisfaction with his occupation took root. You might have thought that this frankness on the girl's part would have kept Henry from falling in love with her. Certainly, the dignified thing would have been to change his seat at table and take his meals next to someone who appreciated the romance of detective work a little more. But no, he remained where he was, and presently Cupid, who never shoots with a surer aim than through the steam of boarding-house hash, sniped him where he sat. He proposed to Alice Weston. She refused him. "Oh, it's not because I'm not fond of you. I think you're the nicest man I ever met." A good deal of assiduous attention had enabled Henry to win this place in her affections. He had worked patiently and well before actually putting his fortune to the test. "Well, I'd marry you tomorrow if things were different. But I'm on the stage, and I mean to stick there. Most of the girls want to get off it, but not me. And one thing I'll never do is marry someone who isn't in the profession. My sister Genevieve did, and look what happened to her. She married a commercial traveller, and you take it from me, he travelled. She never saw him for more than 5 minutes in the year, except when he was selling gents' hosiery in the same town where she was doing her refined specialty. And then he'd just wave his hand and whiz by and start travelling again. My husband has got to be close by where I can see him. I'm sorry, Henry, but I know I'm right." It seemed final, but Henry did not despair. He was a resolute young man. What you have to be to wait outside restaurants in the rain for any length of time. He had an inspiration. He sought out a dramatic agent. "I want to go on the stage in musical comedy." "Well, let's see you dance." "Oh, I can't dance." "Well, sing," said the agent. "Stop singing," added the agent hastily. "You go away and have a nice cup of hot tea," said the agent soothingly, "and you'll be right as anything in the morning." Henry went away. A few days later, at the bureau, his fellow detective Simmons hailed him. "Here, you, the boss wants you, buck up." Mr. Stafford was talking into the telephone. He replaced the receiver as Henry entered. "Oh, Rice. Here's a woman wants her husband shadowed while he's on the road. He's an actor. I'm sending you. Go to this address and get photographs and all particulars. You'll have to catch the 11 o'clock train on Friday." "Yes, sir." "He's in the Girl from Brighton company. They open at Bristol." It sometimes seemed to Henry as if fate did it on purpose. If the commission had had to do with any other company, it would have been well enough, for professionally speaking, it was the most important with which he had ever been entrusted. If he had never met Alice Weston and heard her views upon detective work, he would have been pleased and flattered. Things being as they were, it was Henry's considered opinion that fate had slipped one over on him. In the first place, what torture to be always near her, unable to reveal himself, to watch her while she disported herself in the company of other men. He would be disguised, and she would not recognize him. But he would recognize her, and his sufferings would be dreadful. In the second place, to have to do his creeping about and spying practically in her presence. Still, business was business. At 5 minutes to 11 on the morning named, he was at the station, a false beard and spectacles shielding his identity from the public eye. If you had asked him, he would have said that he was a Scotch businessman. As a matter of fact, he looked far more like a motor car coming through a haystack. The platform was crowded. Friends of the company had come to see the company off. Henry looked on discreetly from behind a stout porter, whose bulk formed a capital screen. In spite of himself, he was impressed. The stage at close quarters always thrilled him. He recognised celebrities. The fat man in the brown suit was Walter Jelliffe, the comedian and star of the company. He stared keenly at him through the spectacles. Other of the famous were scattered about. He saw Alice. She was talking to a man with a face like a hatchet, and smiling too, as if she enjoyed it. Behind the matted foliage which he had inflicted on his face, Henry's teeth came together with a snap. In the weeks that followed, as he dogged the girl from Brighton company from town to town, it would be difficult to say whether Henry was happy or unhappy. On the one hand, to realise that Alice was so near and yet so inaccessible was a constant source of misery. Yet on the other, he could not but admit that he was having the very dickens of a time loafing round the country like this. He was made for this sort of life, he considered. Fate had placed him in a London office, but what he really enjoyed was this unfettered travel. Some gypsy strain in him rendered even the obvious discomforts of theatrical touring agreeable. He liked catching trains. He liked invading strange hotels. Above all, he revelled in the artistic pleasure of watching unsuspecting fellow men as if they were so many ants. That was really the best part of the whole thing. It was all very well for Alice to talk about creeping and spying, but if you considered it without bias, there was nothing degrading about it at all. It was an art. It took brains and a genius for disguise to make a man a successful creeper and spyer. You couldn't simply say to yourself, "Oh, I will creep." If you attempted to do it in your own person, you would be detected instantly. You had to be an adept at masking your personality. You had to be one man at Bristol and another quite different man at Hull, especially if, like Henry, you were of a gregarious disposition and liked the society of actors. The stage had always fascinated Henry. To meet even minor members of the profession off the boards gave him a thrill. There was a resting juvenile of fit-up calibre at his boarding house who could always get a shilling out of him simply by talking about how he had jumped in and saved the show at the hamlets which he had visited in the course of his wanderings. And on this Girl from Brighton tour, he was in constant touch with men who really amounted to something. Walter Jelliffe had been a celebrity when Henry was going to school, and Sidney Crane, the baritone, and others of the lengthy cast were all players not unknown in London. Henry courted them assiduously. It had not been hard to scrape acquaintance with them. The principals of the company always put up at the best hotel, and his expenses being paid by his employer, so did Henry. It was the easiest thing possible to bridge with a well-timed whisky and soda the gulf between non-acquaintance and warm friendship. Walter Jelliffe, in particular, was peculiarly accessible. Every time Henry accosted him, as a different individual, of course, and renewed in a fresh disguise the friendship which he had enjoyed at the last town, Walter Jelliffe met him more than halfway. It was in the 6th week of the tour that the comedian, promoting him from mere casual acquaintance, invited him to come up to his room and smoke a cigar. Henry was pleased and flattered. Jelliffe was a personage, always surrounded by admirers, and the compliment was consequently of a high order. He lit his cigar. Among his friends at the Green Room Club, it was unanimously held that Walter Jelliffe's cigars brought him within the scope of the law forbidding the carrying of concealed weapons. But Henry would have smoked the gift of such a man if it had been a cabbage leaf. He puffed away contentedly. He was made up as an old Indian colonel that week, and he complimented his host on the aroma with a fine old-world courtesy. Walter Jelliffe seemed gratified. "Quite comfortable?" he asked. "Quite, I thank you," said Henry, fondling his silver moustache. That's right. Now tell me, old man, which of us is it you're trailing? Henry nearly swallowed his cigar. What do you mean? Oh, come, protested Jelliffe. There's no need to keep it up with me. I know you're a detective. The question is, who's the man you're after? That's what we've all been wondering all the time. All? They had all been wondering? It was worse than Henry could have imagined. Till now he had pictured his position with regard to the girl from Brighton Company rather as that of some scientist who, seeing but being unseen, keeps a watchful eye on the denizens of a drop of water under his microscope. And they had all detected him, every single one of them. It was a stunning blow. If there was one thing on which Henry prided himself, it was the impenetrability of his disguises. He might be slow, he might be on the stupid side, but he could disguise himself. He had a variety of disguises, each designed to befog the public more hopelessly than the last. Going down the street, you would meet a typical commercial traveller, dapper and alert. Anon, you encountered a heavily bearded Australian. Later, maybe it was a courteous old retired colonel who stopped you and inquired the way to Trafalgar Square. Still later, a rather flashy individual of the sporting type asked you for a match for his cigar. Would you have suspected for one instant that each of these widely differing personalities was, in reality, one man? Certainly you would. Henry did not know it. Henry did not know it, but he had achieved in the eyes of the small servant who answered the front door bell at his boarding house a well-established reputation as a humorist of the more practical kind. It was his habit to try his disguises on her. He would ring the bell, inquire for the landlady, and when Bella had gone, leap up the stairs to his room. Here he would remove his disguise, resume his normal appearance, and come downstairs again, humming a careless air. Bella, meantime, in the kitchen, would be confiding to her ally, the cook, that Mr. Rice has just come in, looking sort of funny again. He sat and gaped at Walter Jelliffe. The comedian regarded him curiously. You look at least 100 years old, he said. What are you made up as, a piece of gorgonzola? Henry glanced hastily at the mirror. Yes, he did look rather old. He must have overdone some of the lines on his forehead. He looked something between a youngish centenarian and a nonagenarian who has seen a good deal of trouble. If you knew how you were demoralizing the company, Jelliffe went on, you would drop it. As steady and quiet a lot of boys as ever you met till you came along. Now they do nothing but bet on what disguise you're going to choose for the next town. I don't see why you need to change so often. Well, you were all right as the Scotchman at Bristol. We were all saying how nice you looked. You should have stuck to that. But what do you do at Hull but roll in a scrubby moustache and a tweed suit, looking rotten? However, all that is beside the point. It's a free country. If you like to spoil your beauty, I suppose there's no law against it. What I want to know is, who's the man? Whose track are you sniffing on, Bill? Well, you'll pardon me calling you Bill. You're known as Bill the Bloodhound in the company. Who's the man? Never mind. He was aware, as he made it, that it was not a very able retort, but he was feeling too limp for satisfactory repartee. Criticisms in the bureau dealing with his alleged solidity of skull he did not resent. He attributed them to man's natural desire to chafe his fellow man. But to be unmasked by the general public in this way was another matter. It struck at the root of all things. I do mind, objected Jelliffe. It's most important. A lot of money hangs on it. We've got a sweepstake on in the company, the holder of the winning name to take the entire receipts. Come on, who is he?"
Henry rose and made for the door. His feelings were too deep for words. Even a minor detective has his professional pride, and the knowledge that his espionage is being made the basis of sweepstakes by his quarry cuts this to the quick.
"Here, don't go. Where are you going?"
"Back to London," said Henry bitterly. "It's a lot of good my staying here now, isn't it?"
"Well, I should say it was. To me. Don't be in a hurry. You're thinking that now we know all about you, your utility as a sleuth has waned to some extent. Is that it?"
Well,
why worry? What does it matter to you? You don't get paid by results, do you? Your boss said, trail along. Well, do it then. I should hate to lose you. I don't suppose you know it, but you've been the best mascot this tour that I've ever come across. Right from the start, we've been playing to enormous business. I'd rather kill a black cat than lose you. Drop the disguises and stay with us. Come behind all you want and be sociable."
a detective is only human. The less of a detective, the more human he is. Henry was not much of a detective, and his human traits were consequently highly developed. From a boy, he had never been able to resist curiosity. If a crowd collected in the street, he always added himself to it. And he would have stopped to gape at a window with "Watch this window" written on it if he had been running for his life from wild bulls. He was, and always had been, intensely desirous of some day penetrating behind the scenes of a theatre. And there was another thing. At last, if he accepted this invitation, he would be able to see and speak to Alice Weston and interfere with the manoeuvres of the hatchet-faced man on whom he had brooded with suspicion and jealousy since that first morning at the station. To see Alice, perhaps with eloquence to talk her out of that ridiculous resolve of hers.
"Why, there's something in that," he said. "Rather. Well, that's settled. Now, touching that sweep, who is it?"
"I can't tell you that. You see, so far as that goes, I'm just where I was before. I can still watch whoever it is that I'm watching."
"Dash it, so you can. I didn't think of that," said Jelliff, who possessed a sensitive conscience. "Purely between ourselves. It isn't me, is it?"
Henry eyed him inscrutably. He could look inscrutable at times.
"Ah,"
he said, and left quickly, with the feeling that, however poorly he had shown up during the actual interview, his exit had been good. He might have been a failure in the matter of disguise, but nobody could have put more quiet sinisterness into that "ah." It did much to soothe him and ensure a peaceful night's rest. On the following night, for the first time in his life, Henry found himself behind the scenes of a theatre, and instantly began to experience all the complex emotions which come to the layman in that situation. That is to say, he felt like a cat which has strayed into a strange, hostile backyard. He was in a new world, inhabited by weird creatures who flitted about in an eerie semi-darkness like brightly coloured animals in a cavern. That concludes Part 1 of Bill the Bloodhound, written by P.G. Wodehouse and read to you by Christine Rendel. You've been listening to Voices of Calm. We bring you stories
Tales, poems, meant to entertain you, to cheer, to soothe and to comfort. Thank you so much for joining, and please join me again for part 2 of Bill the Bloodhound.